Good day guys, nice to have you here. Today we will discuss one of the most asked questions on our channel.
I circle is normal, but yet I still don't get pregnant. What can I use?
And that's, what is the best build for Argus? The truth is, there's no such thing as only one best build for Argus, because there are several good builds for Argus. On this video, I will provide to you all of the different item builds, their strengths and weaknesses, which situations will work best for such item builds, and the hero types these item builds are good against, so make sure to keep on watching until the end of the video. Before we continue though, I want to give my shoutouts to Geo Plays Games, LK Gaming, and Sun Zilong Johnson, and they too hosts YouTube channels, so make sure to give them some love. We'll kick things off with the most common build for Argus, and that's the attack speed critical build. This build, as the name implies, focuses on dealing critical damage within the shortest period of time. The goal of this build is to finish off the enemy as quickly as possible, preferably under 3 seconds, as this is the most comfortable spot in using his ultimate, then having as much as 1 to 2 seconds left to either take 1 or 2 more heroes down or escape. This build is the most powerful build against squishy heroes such as most marksmen and assassins. This is ideal against heroes that have average to below average physical armor, because of its potential to deal thousands of critical damage in less than 2 seconds, this is considered the strongest item build if we only consider raw power as basis. Also, Argus can be played as a jungler using this build. While I'm not exactly a fan of jungler Argus since this makes him more prone to crowd control, this is ideal only when enemy lineups doesn't revolve around hard crowd control skills. This build is however weak against heroes that have high physical armor. As we all know, critical damage is something that can be weakened by high physical defense. Therefore, I wouldn't recommend this build on enemy lineups with 3 or more tanky heroes. Another weakness of this build is its lack of cooldown reduction, which means you have less chances of using the most iconic skill of Argus, which is Eternal Evil, his ultimate. This makes it easier for the enemy team to play aggressively once you have used your ultimate, since they know it will take a significant amount of time before your ultimate becomes available again. The core items of this build are Berserker's Fury, Scarlet Phantom, and Corrosion Sight. Berserker's Fury is your main critical engine. This is ideally bought as your first item. Next is Scarlet Phantom. I recommend buying this after getting yourself a pair of boots. This is going to be your attack speed engine. Berserker's Fury and Scarlet Phantom are items with perfect synergy. Both of these items benefit from each other's effects. Berserker's Fury increases your critical damage dealt on enemies for every critical strike made, while Scarlet Phantom increases your attack speed every time you proc a critical strike. Corrosion Sight supplements your second skill's ability to slow down enemies and increase the user's movement speed temporarily. This item is what makes it possible for Argus to stick to his targets. This too has excellent synergy with Scarlet Phantom, as it increases the user's attack speed after each attack. For the boots, choose from Sweep Boots or Magic Shoes for most enemy lineups, or Tough Boots if the enemy relies on hard crowd control. Personally, I only use Tough Boots when the enemy team has Solina. The optional items for this build are Sea Halberd, Blade of Despair, Wind Talker, Has Claws, and Demon Hunter Sword. Sea Halberd is best used for obvious reasons, and that's when you're up against any hero that relies heavily on Spell Vamp, HP regeneration, or shield regeneration. Blade of Despair is actually my favorite item on Argus, as it gives him a huge bump on his physical attack and provides permanent bonus movement speed as well. However, due to its expensive cost, I consider this as an optional item and should only be purchased when you are dominating the game. Has good map control and is already earning gold with no issues at all. Wind Talker, in my opinion, has been nerfed on the late game but buffed on the early game, as it now no longer relies on critical rate for higher magic critical damage. However, the damage is no longer as high as it was before. This works well in increasing his attack speed and movement speed, and is best purchased if you don't need Sea Halberd. Has Claws is basically your sustain item. I don't normally get this for Argus, but in the event the enemy has good sustain and see Halberd is not cutting it, then I suggest improving your survivability by having this item. As of now, this item still holds the strongest lifesteal in the game and boasts a decent amount of damage as well. Plus the cost is very affordable. Very ideal in situations when you're struggling and earning gold due to the dominance of the opposing team. Demon Hunter Sword is a very controversial item as a lot of people consider this as one of the main items for Argus, but there are actually a good number of reasons why this item may be unnecessary now after he got revamped. After Argus got revamped, he no longer gains more energy when his HP is low, therefore his sudden burst and attack speed is gone, thus rendering the efficacy of this item less. Since Argus is lower now, that means the burst potential of this item is no more. It used to be great as a clutch item when Argus was low on HP, but due to the changes in his passive, this item is reduced to nothing but a regular attack speed item with mediocre damage and lifesteal. In addition to that, Demon Hunter Sword conflicts with critical rate due to the way the damage is calculated. Demon Hunter Sword applies its bonus damage after the basic attack's damage has been dealt. This means a critical damage inflicted on a target will actually lessen Demon Hunter Sword's damage rather than increasing it. Now, I'm not saying Demon Hunter Sword is inappropriate. What I'm trying to say is don't prioritize it. Instead, buy it on the late game as either a 6th item or a replacement for your boots in extended matches. Getting it on the early game is counterproductive, especially since its damage is based on the current remaining HP of your target, and heroes on the early game have lower HP, which means the damage of this item will be less as well. On the other hand, heroes' HP is significantly higher on the late game, which makes the damage of this item far greater than on the early game. Next is my favorite build, which is the cooldown reduction critical penetration build. This item build requires an emblem with at least 10% cooldown reduction in order to be effective, since one of your main goals is to max out your cooldown reduction. I favor this build because it works well against the current meta in itemization right now for most heroes regardless of role, which is to have 2 or more defensive items. What makes this build powerful is its potential to take down squishy heroes such as marksmen and assassins in less than 1.5 seconds. Another strength of this build is its ability to ignore the target's physical armor due to the presence of damage penetration items. This makes it capable of dealing the highest single attack burst from all of the other item builds for Argus. Best of all, it minimizes one of the main weaknesses of Argus, which is his squishiness without his ultimate. That's because besides generating the highest damage possible in a single attack, like I said earlier, it also aims to reach 40% cooldown reduction, which allows Argus to dramatically lower his ultimate's cooldown. Just imagine being immortal every 22 seconds. That's right. His ultimate cools down in only 22 seconds at level 3 once you have all of your core items. Another strength of this build is its potential to take down tankier heroes such as fighters, unlike the attack speed critical build which is more effective against squishier targets. This can be a viable jungler as well. I, however, don't think this is the best role for Argus, especially for this build, due to its lower attack speed. Instead, I favor using Purify for this build in order to continuously sustain attacks on your enemies, which will help you not just take them down, but also deal enough damage in order to gain more HP from your ultimate. The problem with this build is due to its lower attack speed, you have to make sure you hit your target with your first skill in order to successfully stun, and hit it with one of your basic attacks and second skill. Once you miss your target, it'll be harder for you to take them down. Also, since this build relies on your ultimate in order to sustain HP and survive clashes, it lacks passive HP sustain such as lifesteal due to the absence of such items in order to give way for higher burst damage and cooldown reduction. War Axe is an item that's meant to help you deal greater damage in the event your enemy survives your dive-in and reaches the point that you had to use your ultimate. This will also help you gain a temporary movement speed boost which helps you out in chasing targets down. In addition to that, this item has cooldown reduction which is required in making this build successful. Berserker's Fury for the same reasons stated earlier, and same goes with Scarlet Phantom. Hunter Strike is an underrated item. It provides above average damage output, cooldown reduction, and has temporary movement speed boost which stacks with War Axe's effects. The boots are optional. You can either have sweep boots or magic shoes. For this build, however, I prefer magic shoes since it's a cheap way of gaining additional cooldown reduction. You can always sell it on the late game and swap it out for a different item. Same as usual, if the enemy team relies on hard crowd control, I recommend tough boots, especially against Solina. The optional items for this build are Corrosion Sight, Sea Halberd, Blade of Despair, Wind Talker, and Demon Hunter Sword for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. For this build, however, I also have Endless Battle and Blade of Heptasis as other optional items. I rarely get Endless Battle, and if I do, I swap it in place of the boots. Most of the stats this item provides is essential to Argus, such as the bonus of physical damage and pure damage, temporary bonus movement speed, and cooldown reduction. This item works fairly well due to the reliance of this build in executing a skill and a basic attack combo. Blade of Heptasis has good synergy with Argus' second skill since it slows down your target's movement speed. In addition to that, this offers a temporary buff on your first strike, which further supplements the playstyle of this build. Finally, the Bruiser build. This item build intends to balance offense and defense by equipping 1 to 2 defensive items in order to survive heroes with high burst potency. It doesn't focus on one attribute but instead favors being able to stay in clashes longer. This build is great against the burst strategy wherein the enemy team picks heroes that have the potential to auto-delete their targets in a split second. While it can't guarantee absolute survival, it however ensures that it lessens the chances of you getting down by spontaneous skill bursts, thus giving you sufficient time to use your ultimate. This build is very dynamic as it can incorporate cooldown reduction, critical strikes, non-critical strikes, damage per second, and high burst. In other words, the damage items we have discussed earlier can all be applied on this build. The focal point of this build, however, is buying the right defensive items in order to survive spontaneous skill bursts. The Bruiser item build doesn't have a core item but instead focuses on building according to the enemy team's lineup. What you need to focus on are the attributes. You have to build your items and consider both of these attributes. If you have much lower attributes than this in relation to your level, you won't be able to finish off your enemies in time. The ideal attack speed should be between 1.4 to 1.9, and physical attack should be between 170 to 340 depending of course on your level. Play with caution because this item build requires the most knowledge when it comes to identifying what items to buy. A lot of factors will come into play other than the enemy team's lineup. The items they purchase also strongly dictate which items you need to buy. You also have to consider team scores, levels, and gold earnings to determine the itemization sequence. The problem of this build is after Argus got revamped, his damage and attack speed were significantly nerfed. Therefore, the damage output of this build is much weaker than before. Don't expect to get a lot of kills with this build since its purpose is to survive and soak in enemy skills in order for your teammates to gain better traction in clashes. In my opinion, this is the weakest build for Argus. It basically is ideal only as a desperate strategy in order to survive the game in the event the enemy team picks a lot of high burst heroes. Since this item build doesn't have a definite physical damage item and the viable items needed for this build were all discussed earlier, this time we will focus only on the defensive items that works well in making this build viable as a counter against a full burst enemy composition. Like I said earlier, this item build does not have a core item and instead is built based on the factors I mentioned before, which means the items I will discuss are all optional and may or may not be equipped together. Brute Force Breastplate works well with your second skill and getting stacks that will provide Argus with temporary movement speed bonus for better positioning and chase. This works great with either Hunter Strike, Wind Talker, Corrosion Sight, War Axe, Blade of Despair, and Endless Battle. Oracle helps in improving your HP regeneration, especially your ultimate's HP regen. This item also has cooldown reduction, which works well with the cooldown reduction critical penetration build. Athena's shield in the event the enemy team is comprised mainly of high burst magic damage, and of course immortality due to obvious reasons. I strongly recommend choosing Sweep Boots for this item build due to the overall build's low attack speed. And of course, last but not the least, our bonus item. Fleeting Time is something I consider as a troll build on Argus, so buy it with caution. Again, buy it with caution. Getting this item means that your physical damage will be less. However, I find it mind-boggling that Argus is capable of using his ultimate spontaneously with this item. Just take a look. That concludes our game guide for today. If you have any other ideas on what items to build on Argus, be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you want me to upload more videos just like this, please hit like, share, and subscribe. Stay safe everyone. Peace.